Just a little bit. See, Sigmund and I have to wear funny hats so people notice us. Dr. Gene just has to show up.
We
He
crave
has to
attention.
show up and be awesome. Like Matt Waldman. He shows up and he's awesome. That's what we have. And we'll go on in 3, 2, 1. WNBC. What's up with Justin Fields and this medical condition we learned about yesterday? How much will it impact his draft stock? All that and more tonight on the Audible Live. Cecil Lammey, Sigmund Bloom, Matt Waldman, Dr. Jene Bramel. And we will start, Dr. Gene, with the Justin Fields situation. It's always interesting to me when these medical things get released. Again, reporters are going to report, so I'm not necessarily saying that, but the timing of this, I think maybe Matt and I and Sigmund will talk about that a little bit later. But let's talk about Justin Fields dealing with epilepsy. Doctors believe he could grow out of it like other family members have. We have players in the past, Hall of Fame players like Alan Faneca, who dealt with epilepsy during their playing career. This isn't something we normally talk about, Dr. Gene, but certainly the timing of this, like I said, very curious. What does it mean for Justin Fields?
I don't think it's going to mean all that much. As often happens when teams get a look at medical files, some things get leaked for, competitive reasons or otherwise. And this isn't new for Fields. This is something that he's been dealing with since he's a child. So the Buckeyes have been well aware of it. And I would imagine it's relatively common knowledge around the league. You'd be surprised if it wasn't. And for him to be played football as long as he has through, his childhood days, through high school, and now through college at Ohio State, and have it to be managed as well as it is, I don't know that we want to put credence one way or another and whether or not he's going to grow out of it at this point. You just hope that the frequency doesn't increase. I don't think that, risk of concussion or risk of head injury in the National Football League puts him at any necessarily long-term risk of this. They'll manage the medications he's on carefully, make sure that they keep him hydrated and in a good condition as much as possible, and then just continue to monitor him. So I don't think this is likely to affect his draft stock at all, and I wouldn't expect it to affect his career at all either.
Good evening, Dr. Gene. Ask you just an open-ended question, okay? Because I was talking to Dane Brugler this week on the couch, and he said, some teams might break a tie against a player who opted out when the other player is someone who played. They had tape from 2020. How much would it concern you, or would it even concern you, that a player didn't play last year? Do you think it's important for players to stay in that rhythm? Is that something that would make you need to investigate further? Or if the player was in football shape, then you would say, no big deal?
Yeah, and I think I'm good. That was a great show, as always, by the way, on the couch. I'm going to echo what he said, which is if you feel like on tape that the player can play, then I don't think there's too much issue with him missing some time. So if you identify NFL quality production and elite athletic talent and traits, then I think that translates. And yes, you probably would feel a little bit better if that player had, if you had another 10 to 12 games of tape, and some of them against some of the best competition, to be able to show that, in coming months and years, that he was able to sustain that level of production. But I don't think that matters that much. I think what you guys spoke about, being teams not being able to get a chance to meet someone in person and talk to someone in person, is probably going to play a much bigger role rather than the opt-outs. We may learn differently. There's 32 teams. I would doubt that those players that opted out, if they were considered NFL talents to begin with, I don't think we're likely to see them drop that far because of playing time or, playing concerns, talent concerns, what have you. I think they're probably good to go.
Well, Gene, I've just figured out that there's a way to determine how good of a doctor you actually are. You ready? All right. You ready? We can determine right now. We can do it right now.
Rochambeau.
Okay. Oh, really? Oh, yeah. I was looking at. I was okay. Let's go. You ready?
You were scared. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh, see, pretty good. He's thinking along my line, so it means he's a pretty shitty. Well, excuse me, pretty bad doctor. Sorry, that's about the first time I've done that.
We're going again?
Yeah.
Right, you count.
1, 2, 3.
You lose.
All right, you got me. All right, so you get to pick the question. Which question do you want? What do you
That's
want to
all
talk
this was about anyway. You
That's
actually
right.
beat me there, didn't you? You were trying to get me to. No, I was letting y'all know that I have some follow up on Trey Sermon. When we talked about the collarbone issue last week, I wasn't aware of what the injury was. And after putting some time in and putting the running back article together this week, I had some time to look into Sermon, and it seems pretty clear. I don't know that he's confirmed this or the team did necessarily, but those around the team and some of the local Ohio State folks have reported this as a sternoclavicular dislocation, which is the joint between the sternum, the breastbone, and the collarbone there. And we've seen this with Ben Roethlisberger. We've seen it with Danny Amendola, a number of other players in recent years. It's a concerning injury in the moment because when that collarbone gets pushed back towards the chest, there's very important structures underneath there from big blood vessels and what have you. So he had to go to the hospital that night to have that dislocation put back into place. And that was done without any concern. There wasn't anything a little bit lower. That tends to be a 4 to 6 week injury, as we've seen in the past. It's not surprising, as we said last week, that he was able to participate in the pro day, but not on the bench press. You'd think he, at this point, pretty much fully healed. I don't think there's any concern for his draft stock, and certainly no concern for him participating in OTAs. Again, whatever that turns out to look like team by team this year, and it shouldn't affect his long-term production. So good to go at this point. No issues with pro day and beyond.
It is the Audible Live here Thursday night on our YouTube channel. Make sure to do all those YouTube things, like, comment, share, subscribe, and check out footballguys.com so you can read the injury rounds, running back injuries to watch, of course, written by Dr. Jene Bramel. Let's talk about Saquon Barkley and how he's questionable for training camp.
Yeah, I think the issue with Barkley, and we talk about this a lot with ACL injuries during the season and then after the season and through the preseason, is how important it is to know whether or not there's any associated injuries with the ACL. Not that an isolated ACL is a guaranteed recovery, not that that's a 6 to 7 month injury. Routinely, there are always some complications that can come up with that, and players still have to focus and get through rehab successfully. But when there are associated injuries, MCL sprains that take some time to heal before the surgery, or in Barkley's case, not only an MCL sprain, but a meniscus tear that was repaired, that complicates rehab, and I wouldn't say delays recovery, but it extends the recovery because it takes a little bit of time. And the issue with the meniscus repair is, although they still try to do this to some extent, an isolated ACL, you have a reconstructive procedure, you get back to rehab immediately, and they're working on range of motion immediately. I don't like to do that with meniscus repairs because it puts the integrity of the sutures and things like that at risk. So there was a period of time where he had to spend in a brace, and although they were being very careful in doing some range of motion, it's not the same as very soon as possible after the surgery where you start doing some range of motion with the ACL. So he had, I think it was almost 6 weeks after the injury. That was the amount of time that they allowed the MCL and some of the swelling from the meniscus tear to go down before they did the ACL reconstruction. So although it was a September injury, he really didn't start rehab until close to the end of October. I think his surgery was actually on Halloween. So, you put 7 to 9 months after that, knowing that there's a little bit of increased degree of difficulty with the meniscus repair. He has said that things are going as well as expected, and he's expecting himself to be ready for week 1. But, Barkley is at high risk, I would think, of starting camp on the PUP list. And depending on how his recovery goes, I don't think there's a guarantee that he's ready for week 1. So I've got him marked questionable for training camp just because you're not sure exactly where those last couple of months of rehab is going to go as he returns to more football-related type activities, and whether or not they're going to clear him to participate in training camp early, middle, or late. So I think that there's a reasonable expectation that he can be ready for week 1, but this is a situation that we're going to have to watch pretty carefully all the way through the summer months.
Can I tell a story about Cecil and rock, paper, scissors? Just because. I mean, I want to tell it. Well, I just want everyone to know, because rock, paper, scissors, this, someone in the chat room said, take it easy on Sirianni. Cecil won a massive jackpot at the last Football Guys retreat and it was down to him. It was a bracket. And, we do this gift exchange thing. And you throw in like $10 if you want to protect your gift or steal a gift, whatever. There's a pretty big pot that builds up, and it came down to Cecil and Danny Tucito, who's like Mars Attacks brain. And if you don't know Danny, or you don't know about the inner workings of rock, paper, scissors strategy, there is an algorithm. There's an algorithm to winning rock, paper, scissors. I might have told this story on the show before, I don't know. And Danny knows that algorithm in and out. And Cecil, how many times did you and Danny go around for the pot? 13, 14, 15 times?
15 times, yeah.
Every time they would reveal the same thing. And then Cecil finally won because Cecil so flustered Danny that he made him abandon the algorithm and say, I just can't beat Cecil. I don't know how Cecil knows what I'm going to do. And, so you get the all-time gold cup. All right, back
and
to
I had no idea about the algorithm.
But that's the best part.
Algorithm.
That's the best part. You're like, algorithm? Danny's like, oh, you knew the algorithm. You knew how to match me at every turn. She was like, huh?
Just
what algorithm?
Cecil's like, because I can.
I could read your mind.
It was an all-time moment. This moment in rock, paper, scissors history. Let's talk about this moment in Joe Mixon history, Gene. And as you pointed out in the article, Giovanni Bernard, now a Tampa Bay Buccaneer, which is, you kind of are happy for him, to be honest. Samaje Perine, get out the motorboat. He's the guy now who could be a nice waiver wire pickup or maybe someone you stash away because Joe Mixon can't seem to play a full season. Now, the last we saw him, he had a minor foot sprain that turned into, week 6, he didn't play for the rest of the year. No surgery, which can be a good thing, but also, how do we jive a player missing that much time but not needing surgery, and how should it affect his outlook for this year?
It's the Bengals. Part of that. So, and I think that does have a lot to do with in this situation. I think that situation got confused because of how Zach Taylor handled the media, and how difficult it can be from coach to coach to, it's the same system there in terms of trying to get information. So we've seen it with AJ Green. We've seen it with other players in the past. It can be just difficult to get a read on there. And what fooled me from week 6 through whatever it is, week 10 or what have you, until there was maybe a little bit of setback in his recovery that we heard of, is that he was standing on the sidelines in practice. He was never in a walking boot. Nobody seemed to be much concerned. And when you heard week to week, and that's what you're seeing with a foot sprain, and it's not immobilized, there's every reason to believe that, okay, that's a reasonable expectation. We weren't getting anything from the national media that suggested otherwise. So, and then I think as the weeks went on, Joe Burrow had a knee injury of his own. The team wasn't doing well. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense to put him out there unless he was fully recovered. And, players like to play. Players want to put some stats up there for whatever long-term goals or things they may have. So for him not to play, still a little bit concerning. But I think you mentioned the important thing there. At no point was it decided that joint was not stable enough to get through without surgery. So everything we've heard from the offseason from Mixon himself sounds positive at this point. Zach Taylor has kind of said the same thing. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Samaje Perine is the third down, passing down option that Gio Bernard was. So, he is more of a backup than a complement, I would think, to Joe Mixon. So that would be another piece of information that would suggest that, the Bengals aren't that concerned. It's not like they would have had to pay Bernard a lot. He's a great pass protecting back. He fills a role that maybe isn't on the roster right now. So I think that's a good sign that would suggest, well, we think Mixon can play that role, even though he hasn't finished a season particularly healthy recently and have had some other issues there. So I'm reasonably reassured that we're going to see him be available for OTAs and certainly for training camp. I don't think this particular injury is going to be a long-term situation. You know how I feel about the term injury prone. Hard to know whether or not there's, what's the next thing that's going to happen to Joe Mixon at his age, and with the investment the Bengals have made in him and with the investment they haven't made elsewhere on that running back depth chart, you'd expect him to be pretty healthy for the regular season.
Yeah, I'll add cheap consideration for Travion Williams, possibly.
True.
That's all I would say as a speculative play. Let's talk a little bit about Zach Moss walking the tightrope. Tell us a little bit more about that particular surgery procedure. Tua Tagovailoa had it, certainly came back from it well, but he's not a running back. So talk to us about that history and if that matters at all.
Yeah, I think that surgery has come into vogue a little bit more in teams and players and orthopedic surgeons who may want to accelerate the timeline of rehab. It stabilizes the joint a little bit sooner than allowing it to heal. Some players who may not have had surgery in the past because it involved larger incisions, plates, and screws to hold that joint together are now choosing it's just the tightrope is a kind of figure of 8 suture that they put through those lower leg bones there to hold that ligament together. And the thought is you can get back to rehab a little bit sooner. Tua was able to return to college games within 4 to 6 weeks, whereas these injuries oftentimes take a little bit longer. I don't think that there wasn't much chance that even had Buffalo made it to the Super Bowl that he was going to return. They put him on injured reserve right afterwards, but I think they did so with the expectation that they thought this would help stabilize the injury, get him a jump start into the offseason activities if necessary. And he's another player that you would expect to be ready right away. Maybe because he's becoming an important part to the offense that you see him maybe not take so many reps in offseason activities if they happen out in Buffalo, but he should be ready to go early on in training camp.
It is the Audible Live. We'll go once more around the ride for Dr. Jene Bramel, and I have to get out my handy-dandy NFL notebook, Dr. Jene, because earlier this week I talked to NFLPA President J.C. Tretter, and he told me that 23% fewer injuries last year, 30% fewer concussions. The ACLs were the second lowest they've been in 5 years, basically because they didn't have OTAs. Where do you come down on this? You know, it's, I don't know, controversial because the Broncos were a team not everybody chose, but most players chose to stay away from voluntary workouts, mainly due to COVID concerns and protocol issues. But J.C. Tretter, again, NFLPA president, give me all those good data points on injuries and how players, you know, are reconsidering voluntary work. Where do you come down? What do you think of those numbers? He also mentioned things about the games being more exciting. More teams were in it in week 17 than before in NFL history. It seemed like scoring was up. Like all these sorts of things seem to be better, yet you hear from some people as they shake their fist at the heavens, these millionaires don't want to practice.
And penalties were down, and there was an extra playoff team. And, you know, I'm fine with the players making that argument, but realize that they're making an argument in their favor for something that they want. And they're probably none too pleased that we've added a 17 game to the schedule this year. So I think the fewer times you are put in a position to have an injury, the less likely you're going to see an injury. So without question, it's no surprise that the number of injuries last year in the age of COVID, when there weren't nearly as many practices and there weren't nearly as many padded practices and there weren't nearly as many team drills, is not surprising. What you would wonder there, you know, the devil's advocate argument is by having fewer practices and having fewer periods of time where the players are in the facilities with the medical staff, training staff, rehab staff, all of those folks, if they're not in the facilities that often, are you likely to see more injuries because players are not in as good a condition? And where is the overlap there? At what point does the law of diminishing returns come into play, where there are fewer opportunities to be injured, but your conditioning isn't good as it would have been otherwise, and you're not in good football condition versus cardiovascular condition, and that puts you at risk for that reason. So I think there's so many confounding factors with COVID last year that it's going to be really difficult to say, other short of, you know, as we're saying, that, you know, fewer opportunities are going to equal fewer injuries, whether or not that's something that's important to continue in future years or not. And I'm sure the coaches have something to say about it. Some players may feel a little bit differently, but I think that's where I would start. And I think anything that we can do to improve player safety is important. Maybe the better thing to do is to make sure that those practices are as healthy as possible by using the GPS data that they're getting more and more of, and otherwise in protecting players that way, rather than finding ways to keep them out of the facility, COVID or otherwise.
Gene, let's talk a little baseball. Sorry, Cecil. Nails on the chalkboard. Hey, the Pirates are 8-4 in their last 12 games, and the Reds scored 11 runs today and lost. But I really want to ask, Gene, are you a purist? These rules, 7 innings and double headers, a runner on second base, it's like Little League. What do you think about baseball and these rules to make the game move faster, I guess?
All right. I don't think I'm a fan of the 7-inning doubleheaders. I could take or leave the runner on second base in extra innings. I don't really see much need for 17-inning games necessarily. Some of these, I mean, you mentioned the Reds games. They've had 2 10-inning games in the last 2 days, and I think there are I'm reading what you're putting up there. You guys are laughing at me because I'm taking this question too seriously. I'm a baseball guy, so I'm a football guy as well. But just, you know, I think there have been 12 or 13 runs scored in the 10th inning in both of those games. Bizarre.
Right.
So I just got a kick out of them trying to play through a snowstorm and the relief pitcher just tossing every ball out at the same time, telling the umpires they were fools.
Yeah,
that was the best part of the weekend.
Miguel Cabrera in the middle of a blizzard, sliding.
Couldn't tell if he had a double or a home run.
The old timers in Detroit were still talking about that a week later when we were there. All right, baseball talk over.
Moving on.
I think I strained an ab muscle out of boredom on that one. Trying to feign like I was sleeping and jerking back up. But no, seriously. Talk us a little bit about James Conner and his plantar plate repair. Certainly, I know that the two guys above us are probably happy he's gone, but he ends up in Arizona. And what are his prospects, at least from a standpoint of being able to stay healthy with that particular injury?
I think one of the issues with this injury is that although it's repaired and although you expect a full recovery, the time between the moment you are cleared to football-related activity and are able to return to play and the time where you feel fully recovered is a matter of months. So it's not just, you just have to get back into condition a little bit. There are range of motion and pain issues that are left over after the surgical procedure that are known and documented, where players may not feel themselves for a while, or at least need to continue to play on an orthotic. And that may not limit him much, but we already saw a player last year that didn't seem to be as explosive laterally or vertically as he was before. And now we're dealing with a toe injury for a running back. He's getting older in years and those sorts of things. So a combination of all those factors would have you concerned that you're just not seeing a capable lead back anymore. So, depending on what happens with the depth chart over time, I don't think he's starting week one as a 20+ carry situation. And I wouldn't expect that of him at any point this year. And the number of games he'd be able to sustain that, if they do ask it of him, you'd be concerned about. So I think you're going to see him in training camp. I expect him to be healthy enough to play, but whether I wouldn't expect him to perform at his 2018, 2019 levels.
Can I ask one quick follow-up question to this?
Only if it's about baseball.
Okay. And it is. I'm just curious. It seems like there were years when running backs, back in the 70s and 80s were quite more, or at least seem more durable. Now they seem like salmon swimming upstream. So why do you think that is?
I think some of it has to do with the increasing force in which football is played. So not that players were smaller or had less strength back then, but we're talking about players that are moving 20 miles an hour at high speed, changing direction very quickly in shoes that are designed to do that and not exactly providing a lot of support, in pads that may or may not make you feel indestructible at times. So the amount of athleticism that's required to play the position, the number of carries that they're asked to take with those collisions and with that agility and all of the unexpected things happening around them leads to injury. And in recent years, the NFL's even put on the locker room walls, these are the shoes that you may want to consider, these are the helmets you may want to consider, these are the things that are putting you at higher risk. And we're talking about elite athletes moving at much higher speeds than before. And that, we always say, you ask me about injury prone, and I say, people say football is a collision sport, not a contact sport. I just say it's raw trauma, 60, 70 times a game. So, and when that happens, everybody is injury prone in that sense. So I think it has a lot to do with that. It doesn't have it. I'm not saying that players aren't in good condition, what have you, but the demands that are placed on that position and all positions are such that it is very difficult to expect a player to have a fully healthy, full snap 16-game season, and now we're going to 17 games. So, the stresses and demands placed on players at this point are going to be even higher.
This is very anecdotal, and I'm sure that there's going to be easy disproof of this, but it's interesting to me that guys like Frank Gore, Emmitt Smith, and Walter Payton, none of them were extremely fast, had very long careers, and I wonder if there's something to be said of Marshawn Lynch was, he was off and on. He was a guy who took a ton of hits and played through a lot of that too. I wonder if there's something to be said about the overemphasis of certain metrics that maybe trying to get players who are like these. It's like, I hate to say it, like breeding, but it's like the way that we idealize a certain type of player or type of situation to the point where it's like with quarterbacks. It's like we want them to be in these quarterback camps forever. And maybe it's at one point it seemed like a bad thing if they played other sports when these great quarterbacks all played other sports. Is it are we getting to a point where it's a bad thing? We're trying to make these guys into whip it fast players who where speed is like only 5% of the real thing, but now they end up having these other issues because of the fact that we're trying to maximize something that's not nearly as important as other people make it.
Yeah, and it's trade-offs. And I would say a couple of things about that list that you gave. All of those players had significant injuries over their career. They were a little bit more durable and long-lasting than other players. But Frank Gore tore up his knee in college and has had some issues,
Sure.
fewer than others. Adrian Peterson, from collarbone to sports hernia to ACL to some other things later in career, some soft tissue injuries have cost him time. Marshawn Lynch, not so much, but there were sports hernia issues and other things that he dealt with as well that left him out a little bit. And those players, I think there's a difference between you generating and bracing the contact yourself, or you being able to, I mean, you mentioned this in your RSP time and time again, an understanding of how to, you mentioned it with Trey Sermon. You trotted how many games? 8 to 10 games, and the guy never got hit by a defensive lineman. I mean, ridiculous. So there is a talent involved in that, and we know that, we've kind of, over the last 20 years, all of us have been long enough to remember that Football Outsiders and the curse of 370 and that sort of stuff, and and then some of the understanding of the research that done afterwards that said, players that take high volume and prove that they can be a high volume player, there's something about them that allows them to continue to do that. And you would feel probably better about a player that's proven that he can take 320 to 350 touches in a given season. They're more likely to do that the following year than a player that had 220, because they've already shown that they can, right or wrong. And also, we're just talking just plain outliers. Adrian Peterson, however many years into his career with his ACL, James Anderson said he had the cartilage of a baby in his knee. I mean, how does that happen?
Ho, ho, ho. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And Marshawn Lynch with his bow-legged gait being as effective as he is. How does that happen? Frank Gore destroying his knee in college and then playing longer than anybody else, possibly going to play with his kid in the NFL. How does that happen? So I think there is something to what you're suggesting there for sure. Again, we say this every year when we have the injury-prone discussion. There are players that are injury-prone in this league without question. The teams know who they are. Yeah. We don't necessarily know who they are because we don't have access to their medical files, to their examinations, to their isometric testing where they know in training camp, oh gosh, we got to watch this guy because his right leg is 80% of the left, or I'm just throwing out numbers here, but all of that stuff is there. And that goes to what you're suggesting as well, which is there probably are player types. And we're not going to use the word breeding, but there is a genetic component to your connective tissue is different than somebody else's, is different than somebody else's. Your body type is different than somebody else's. And we could go into long conversations about BMI and types of collagen and all that sort of stuff. But some players are going to be more ready to take the pounding of an NFL season than others. And again, some of that has to do with their preparation and their weightlifting and their conditioning, and some of it has nothing to do with that. So
I think it's environmental selection might be the best way to put it, how coaches select for running backs, and what they think makes a good running back. So there's probably some selection to that. Maybe.
And and I think over time, when you're RSP, you've kind of divided the wide receiver and even the tight end groups up into different categories and different roles. And it is rare right now for a team to have a player that they trust or they want to take 350 carries. So that we may be morphing into, this is a running back role that we need. This is a running back role that we need. This is a running back role that we need. And from, Derrick Henry to, name your 195-pound whatever back, those players are going to be put into different categories as well. And as that occurs with GPS data or otherwise, we're likely to see players maybe be a little bit more healthy because they're put in situations where they're not likely to be asked to do something that their body's not able to handle.
Always the greatest, always the finest. He is Dr. Jene Bramel. You check out his work at footballguys.com and you follow him on Twitter at Jene Bramel. Dr. Jene, namaste to you, kind sir.
I know you were going to say that. That's exactly what I was going to say back to you. See you.
Very good. It's the universe. Speaking of Sigmund, give us a game update. Oh, wait, never mind. How about this? We're going to get to Zara's question here about Devonta Smith in just a little bit, but I want to toss it to you two. The Justin Fields timing of this is really weird, right? Is it just me? Am I just cynical? Am I paranoid? Or is the timing of this release of information, which again isn't new to NFL teams, but is new in this world, is it odd, Sigmund, or not?
Yeah. Well, it's not odd in the context of the NFL, right? This is that time, that week leading up to the draft, is when I've been talking about this a lot lately on the show, like having Eric Galco and having Dane Brugler on this week. We hope that the draft is a game that rewards teams that have a good process, teams that understand you can't have rigid rules, you should have a framework, like what Matt always talks about with practicing for thousands of hours so that when it's your time to solo, you actually have the wherewithal to go the right direction with it. And you hope that all of the uncertainty, whether it's opt-out players, whether it's the number 3, number 4 picks, this is kind of an unprecedented draft where the teams picking from 5 on really don't know what they're going to be looking at with a board. I think most of the time at this point, we have a pretty good idea who's going to be there at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, Cecil Broncos. I mean, and the choices and the forks in the road that they have to deal with. And you want it to reward the teams with a good process. So whoever is putting these things out there, it is not odd or unusual for us to hear, what did it used to be? Wonderlic tests,
Yep.
Or now
Leadership.
what are we hearing? Leadership. And now we're starting to hear things like, Mac Jones is, it's just that he's so smart. He's unbelievably smart. Like no one's ever seen anything like this. As we get closer to the draft, you can feel free to disregard what you hear. And it's a test, right? It's a test for the teams. And sure enough, there are going to be a few bad organizations out there that get thrown off by these tactics. And we'll see. But I think you're right to point it out as odd, but not odd in the context of, and as we always talk about, if teams just concentrated, like I think that the Ravens do this, just concentrate on your board and your fits and stick to your guns and go in there prepared instead of the subterfuge, right? Because we saw, I mentioned it, John Lynch admitted that they went to Patrick Mahomes' pro day as a smokescreen because they already knew they were going to take Solomon Thomas. And then John Lynch called Kyle Shanahan and said, well, maybe we should rethink this, actually, because he's really good. He's really, really good. Yeah. So, the teams that put energy into this subterfuge, this cloak and dagger, they're just wasting energy. And I think it's just an example of how, like Matt always talks about, there are good workplaces, bad workplaces, places that function by sound rules, and places that if you worked there, you would say, I have no faith in the people that are in charge of me.
Matt, what do you think about this timing of it?
I think the more quality quarterbacks are in a draft class, the more likely you're going to see this. I think that's really probably the best answer and the simplest one, regardless of the things that we've talked about with some of the behavior that may stem from race, or to just that a player, they want a certain player and maybe can use something that makes it look bad to try and get the player to drop. And so I wouldn't, for me, like I like Mac Jones. I think Mac Jones is a better player than people realize, but he's someone that it makes it easy to use him as a foil for players who are being used to be downgraded. But I like what Bloom had to say about the idea of, really, to me, it's about competition. And when it comes down to competition, whether you're an individual, a team, an organization, there's nothing wrong with competing with someone else in a healthy way. But when you have to resort to this type of behavior in order to compete, usually that means that you're bringing out the worst in yourself. And the people who compete, usually the best performers are the ones that compete with themselves. There's others that they may use as motivation to a degree, but it's just motivation to say, I got to work harder. What do I have to do to get better? What does he do that I have to do to do more, as opposed to, how do I squash that person, make them look bad in order for me to get what I want or to get how I am? Because when you do that, most of the time it comes out in the wash and it doesn't work out for you long term. And I think that that's what we're seeing with a lot of teams, is that it might be an act of desperation more than anything else. And then we have to understand too that the people that float this information sometimes are just pawns in the whole mix, because
there's a lot of those useful idiots is what I call them. Yeah.
And it even ranges to scouts who may be younger and just don't have the life and worldly experience. And they're embracing the idea that the NFL shield is this magical thing, and I'm sure it was for them when they got hired and they worked hard to get in there. But they've probably gotten high off the fumes of the whole cloistered environment that kind of says, we are different. No one understands us. So when I'm going to share you these golden nuggets, they're actually like just, cow pellets, basically.
They're turds.
Exactly. Yeah. That they're sharing out there. And then they get offended when someone actually questions them, because they're like, well, this is what I was told. And because I was told this, that makes sense. Well, good. There was a Stanford experiment out there where people did what they were told, and they were tossing out, some harmful pieces of, trash out there to a lot of people. And that's a psychology thing that we understand, is that it's like, I just do what I'm told, and therefore I have power, and therefore what I'm doing makes a lot of sense. And that's just this is a very harmless version of the Stanford experiment.
Think of the larger conversation we could have with this, Matt, because especially with people with platforms, and the way that people receive information. This is the thing. You may tweet something that's innocent. And again, think of the larger conversation. But it's the way people receive it. There's useful idiots that are tweeting information or talking about it on ESPN. Their names are Dan Orlovsky. And then there's people that receive it, and they can be useful idiots as well.
Oh, absolutely. Because you're talking about reactive owners. You're talking about GMs who may just decide that they don't trust their scouting department, and decide that they need to bring in outside people to actually, provide information. But instead of taking those outside people and saying, you know what, you have some worthwhile information that we could use. But in order to do that, we want to bring everyone together and say, let's decide on some ground rules of how we're going to come about this information, how we want to use it, what kind of information we want you to gather, and how you want to define that, how we want to use all this together. But instead, what they do is they say, all right, you're a silo, you're a silo, you're a silo, you're a silo, and I'm going to use all of you and bounce it off of you and triangulate all of this information like I'm like some narcissistic parent who's like, basically saying, you did what I want you to do, so therefore you're the example today. You're a piece of crap because, you didn't do what I had you do, and try and motivate people that way. And you see owners do this. I'm sorry, the guy in the chat room who said ease off on Nick Sirianni. So I'm going to ease off on Nick. But what about Jeffrey Lurie? So, what he did was basically that type of poor style of management. Now, it may have gotten him lots of places because guess what? That was the older method that people learned, and there's also a lesson about evolving.
There's a lesson to be learned about how you got your success.
Yeah.
Because successful people, and I happen to like Jeffrey Lurie, at least the times I've been around him, not that I've been around him a bunch,
right?
But when you're that successful, even NFL players or business people, whatever, every decision I've made, Mark Cuban, every decision I've made has got me to this point, so of course I'm right. But they're not realizing, it's almost like people are trying to make up the Pat Mahomes thing.
Yeah.
Why he's successful like this? It's like, no, he's not successful for the reasons you think he's successful. My apologies to the listening audience, because I have to run here in just a little bit, but I did want to get to Devonta Smith. Zari, our guy, says, today I officially overcame my Devonta Smith BMI fears. I feel like a new man. Full send with Smith. Okay, Sigmund, let's talk about this because our dear friend Jeff Hazley had tweeted out a graphic. If we look at all wide receivers since 2000 to get drafted in the top 3 rounds, weigh under 190 pounds, have a BMI under 25, we get a sample size of 21 receivers. Only one had a wide receiver 1 in their career. Only 10%, 2 of 21, surpassed 200 PPR FPs, fantasy points, in their career. And so the Devonta Smith weight issue thing has been pretty big. And what do you measure? 166 today?
Yeah, 166.
Okay. Bloom, your thoughts?
A non-starter. And part of the reason it's a non-starter is, well, let's see what happens with the NFL. Okay, look, if he falls out of the first round, he's not going to fall out of the first round. Then maybe we pause. But if you're doing these things with models, right? People are doing models where they plug in a bunch of different data and then it's a filter, like, these knockout factors and things like that. Kind of like what Jeff did. What's one of the best indicators, right? What's one of the best indicators? Draft position. So let's not compare Devonta Smith to players, a wide receiver who had this BMI. Let's compare them to players who went in the first round, right? Now, all of a sudden,
don't compare him to Todd Pinkston.
Right. That's not going to help you get any information on what is going to happen in his career. So if he goes in the top 20, and I think that talking to Eric Galco, and Eric Galco is fantastic. I have to see. I know you got to run, so we need to catch up. I'll tell you some funny things Eric and I talked about after our show. Anyway, it's fun when we've been around this little sandbox long enough. It's just fun to talk to people who've been around and have
I'll tell you about one of our adventures that we had in Mobile when Eric was much younger. We're old. We've been around a long time.
So the point is, Eric always keeps it real, and I think he's right. Smith's going to be the third wide receiver off the board. However, he's not in for a big fall or anything like that. I've seen him falling to like Arizona at 16 a lot. Okay, fine. The point is, if with that BMI, the NFL works him up and still deems him worthy of a top 20 pick, that's great reassurance for you that whatever it is, and Eric Crocky, he's fantastic too. He said something to the effect today after this week after the Devonta Smith weight came out, said, okay, so that's his weight, that's his BMI. Show me on tape where you would say, oh, if he was just a little thicker, more rugged, then he would have made this play. Show me those places, and then I'll be concerned. And you can't. I mean, it's just Devonta Smith's game is not held back by his build. So the other thing I would add here is the game is changing. There's more spread offenses. There's more 3 wide receiver sets. There's lighter players on defense. Okay? So when you look backward, you're not necessarily going to have the data that helps you with this case today because it's a different game, and the game's going to continue to change. So I'm not worried.
Matt, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, again, correlation, causation isn't correlation, causation type of thing doesn't really mesh up there very well. We have to understand the broader context of all this too, because you have to understand, from a fantasy perspective, if you want to look at that and say, you know what, he's light, and there aren't a lot of examples of light players. Therefore, I don't want to play the exception, and I play fantasy football more like a risk-adverse accountant, which is fine. A lot of people do that and make a lot of money doing it. And we have a lot of people at Footballguys who do it that way and win, and that's good. That helps a lot of fantasy players who don't want to think too hard and just want the best odds-oriented answers. That's fine. But if you're looking for an edge in highly competitive groups where everyone's playing the odds, then you're going to be picking a guy like Devonta Smith, because you have to understand the broader context. When I counted up, say, the number of seasons where a single player had top 36, top 24, top 12 fantasy production during their career, and I started over the past, 12 years, 13 years now. And what I would do is say, for instance, Deshaun Jackson had a wide receiver 1 season. That's top 12. Let's put it that way. I would also give him a top 36, a top 24 season as well. He'd get credit for each of those things. So, the higher you are, the more credit you get for the lower areas of being a starter. And I have a list of guys with the most seasons, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Top 12 guys. And they're the only player there's basically 6 of those 12 players have had more than 5 seasons of top 12 production, or at least 5. That's Demaryius Thomas, DeAndre Hopkins, Mike Evans, and Julio Jones. And somebody's going to go, and Antonio Brown. Somebody's going to go, see, most of those players were big guys. And you can say, yeah, sure. But again, there's not enough data to support your claim that it's big guys. And you also have to understand that other players on this list include Deshaun Jackson, Antonio Brown, T.Y. Hilton, Mike Wallace, Emmanuel Sanders, and Julian Edelman. Okay. And these guys have a high number of top 24 and top 36 seasons. And what do they have in common? They're not considered primary wide receivers. They were considered the secondary guy, but they still also had top 12 seasons to their credit, other than Edelman. And so what you're looking at here is that it's just rare for players to have repeat production in the starter range, like year after year after year. And we need to understand that, because especially when we're looking at the draft, we talk about dynasty and we're thinking we're going to find Julio Jones. Well, good luck with that. Julio Jones is the top guy. He had 8 top 36, 8 top 24, and 7 top 12 seasons since he's been drafted in 2011. The next highest guy is little Deshaun Jackson, who is selected in round 2 with 8 top 36, 4 top 24, and 2 top 12 seasons. And then Antonio Brown follows after that. And then you get your giant Mike Evans and DeAndre Hopkins, who's average size, average speed, but well above average in every other category that you can imagine that's meaningful. So if you're looking for a type, good luck with that. You ain't going to find it. But if you want to play it safe and go, he's too tiny, and there just aren't a lot of players who are tiny, then, fine. I'll take him.
Matt Waldman, Sigmund Bloom, and me, Cecil Lammey, here on the Audible Live here on Thursday nights. We appreciate each and every one of you for watching, for commenting in the chat room. Even that one guy who got a little odd in the chat room. Keep it coming. And also make sure to comment on the video. The comment in the live chat, we need you to comment on the video. It helps out with the algorithm. Even though YouTube will not like our language at times. Rock,
sorry,
paper,
Joe.
Scissors. Sorry, Joe.
That was my first sorry, Joe, I think.
Ooh.
Wow.
That
I think that's
correct.
I think that's my first sorry, Joe, in like how many years has this been?
I don't know.
Wow.
Like
Sigmund
13?
and shows we're a bad influence on Matt.
Yeah, well, there's lots of times that Matt wanted to go sorry, Joe. I can think of it dozens of times that he would pause and not go sorry, Joe. And then if we're just talking about the danger of his ideas and his way of being in the world, well, it's kind of a perpetual sorry, Joe.
That's true. That could be true. That's very true.
Follow us.
Yeah, I haven't said
all on Twitter. Make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and check out footballguys.com for all of your football information. Matt Waldman is fantastic. Sigmund Bloom is amazing. Dr. Jene Bramel is spectacular.
And the incredible Cecil Lammey.
Saying thanks for watching, everybody. Stay tuned and stay frosty.